I'm Huw Thomas, and I'm a partner at Carey Olsen in Jersey. I practice across a range of areas, most notably in employment and data protection. This is Carey Olsen's podcast, People, Behaviour and Governance, which is really an excuse for us to talk to interesting people and talk about things that interest us. Our very first episode is with Emma Martins, who's currently the Data Protection Commissioner for Guernsey, and has another 3 weeks to run in that role. So welcome, Emma.
Thank you very much, Huw. Good to be here.
So you've been the Data Protection Commissioner since 2017 in Guernsey, haven't you?
Yep.
And before that, in Jersey, you were first the Data Protection Commissioner and then the Information Commissioner between 2011 and 2018.
Yeah, seems a long time ago now, but that's right.
And when did you start in data protection regulation?
Oh, it was too embarrassing to say how long ago that was, but it was a very, very long time ago, and it was the data protection element of it was just an additional duty, believe it or not. So I was a data protection officer in addition to having another full-time job. So it was really very, very low down on the rank of priorities for the organisation. I think that's across the board. It was a long, long time ago now.
So since you've started, the internet's gone from a niche interest to something that touches every part of our lives, including our fridges. And has the law kept pace with what's changed?
Well, it's done its best. I think there's a danger in this area. I mean, data affects our lives in such profound ways these days that there's a danger, I think, of being too critical of the law and expecting too much of the law. I think we need a broader conversation about what we need ethically as well as legally, because by definition, we're in a democracy, right? We may not always feel happy with the way that works out, but we are in a democracy, and drafting laws and getting laws in place and complying with them takes time. And technology is moving so fast that I think it's a bit of a false question to say, is the law keeping up? I think we need to be a bit more intelligent about how we approach data, and that's a big part of what the regulator's role, I think, is, and our role working in data protection is to raise the conversation beyond, is the law fit for purpose? I think the answer is, being brutal, it's probably needs changing and updating now. There's no law on the statute books that couldn't do with some improving, but any data law, however good, is going to have a hard time keeping up. So yes, it could be better, but I think it's done us well so far.
Because when you first sort of started in data protection, which was the early noughties, if we're being vague about it, we've seen a huge amount of change, including the internet itself, mobile telephony, social media, crowd computing, and now sort of AI. Could any law keep up with that?
Well, it's a great question. And I think what we're seeing now are sort of a myriad of laws coming in, AI legislation. And I think the difficulty there, again, is that if we want organisations and businesses to comply with something, we need to make that as easy as possible. So when they've got a day job to do, run a business, and then they've got 3, 4, 5 plus bits of legislation they've got to look to compliance, I'm not sure that's wildly helpful. I'm not sure it's going to really get good outcomes. So again, I don't necessarily have the answer to this, but I think we need to think a little bit outside the box about what regulating data looks like, because it's just so vast, it's so broad, and it's so deep, and it has such a massive impact on our lives in a way that it didn't when I first started out in this role.
And has the job of being a regulator changed in that time?
Well, it's such a great question. I mean, in some ways, it's changed beyond recognition. I mean, the work that we do every day in the office is nothing like the work that we were doing all those years ago. But in a really fundamental and profound way, it's exactly the same, because this is absolutely at its heart about how we treat each other. I mean, our data increasingly now is us. It's our fingerprints, it's our face, it's facial recognition data, as well as data sitting in Excel spreadsheets. And what happens to that data happens to us. So what happens to the data is a profoundly important question when you care about what happens to human beings. And that's always been the case. And that's one of the things that drew me to this, because I was so interested by the public perception of this as being really dry, boring, anti-innovation, that then I saw behind the curtain and thought, gosh, it's anything but. So in a really significant way, it's the same. In a really significant way, it's completely different, if that makes any sense at all.
And when you say I saw behind the curtain, was there a moment that pulled back that curtain for you?
God, there was actually, and it was again a very long time ago now. I was a DPO in the public sector, and my office was very near a huge filing cabinet of lever arch files. This was a long time ago, and we're pre-internet days and all the rest of that. And there was hugely sensitive information in these lever arch files. I mean, hundreds and thousands of pages. And I was looking along the row of these files, and it just hit me, literally like a lightning bolt, is, gosh, these are people. And what happens to this lever arch file really does matter when that information is so sensitive, has the power to do such harm if it's mishandled or if it's lost or if it's inaccurate, all of those things. And it was that moment, genuinely that moment, it sounds so corny, but there's no word of a lie, that the DPO the role I had at the time, it really was an inconvenience to me. And I had the job in the day that I was there to do. But that moment I thought, actually, this matters. And I remember speaking to a very senior member of the organisation, and I tried to explain, I wasn't particularly articulate, about why I thought we needed to shift how we managed it. And he absolutely bought it. And that also taught me the importance of senior management buy-in, senior management supporting the whole conversation piece around data and its value and its opportunities and its risks. And equally, if you don't have it, you're not going to progress. So there were some very, very important lessons for me back in those days, which I've made it my mission to never forget.
And do you think that the role of a sort of regulator in a small island is different from a larger jurisdiction? Is data different in a small jurisdiction than in a...
I think it is. And it's one of the reasons I've just loved working in these islands over the years, and I wouldn't swap it for the world. I mean, first and foremost, it's an obvious thing to say, you're much closer to the community. So, as I referenced before, this is actually about us as human beings. Let's forget the ones and zeros and padlocks and spreadsheets. It's about us. So when you're in a community that you care about and that you love and that you want to flourish, then what happens to data matters. So when you regulate in a small jurisdiction, those things you're keenly aware of those things, and you know people and they know you. So your opportunity for good, positive, constructive influence and communication is there for the taking, which you wouldn't have in a larger jurisdiction. Now, of course, in a larger jurisdiction, the UK or Ireland, they're dealing with the really big tech giants. They're regulating. Maybe it's an impossible task, but their job is to regulate those guys. Now, we don't have that, of course, but this law is about individuals and communities and groups of individuals, and we have as much to say about that in a small jurisdiction as they do in a larger one.
And do you think that we're able to influence any of those discussions? If the UK struggle to regulate an internet giant, can we influence any of those conversations, or is it more difficult?
Do you know, the honest answer is I don't know, but we try. I think sometimes the very least we can do is to just speak when we're given the opportunity to, and talk to people. And yes, looking outwards from the island is important, and the reputation of these islands is important. Of course it is, but fundamentally our job is to look after the community. So how we're seen or not seen on the world stage, for me, it's not irrelevant. I wouldn't go that far, but the priority for me is looking after the rights of the individuals in this jurisdiction. But yes, of course, there are different conversations being held when you're regulating big tech. But those big tech also have the data of our citizens. So we are entitled to an opinion, we're entitled to a voice, and it's important that we do everything we can to empower and educate and engage our own community about some of those areas where they're providing their data, sometimes very sensitive data, to big tech giants that sit in other jurisdictions.
And in terms of whether, I think we touched on, sorry, I can go back to that question. We touched on whether the GDPR, the local versions of the Data Protection Jersey law and the Data Protection Bailiwick Guernsey law being the right laws. Do bits of them need review? What would you change if you could change something tomorrow? Subject access, for instance.
Yeah, and again, I'm disinclined to fret about the details too much. There's a time and a place for law review, and every law, data protection law, is no different, could be improved. And I think there are elements of GDPR which have turned controllers, people who are responsible for compliance, have turned them off. and have made it more difficult, more burdensome. And I think that's a problem, because what you want is for a controller to look at data and think that's a really important asset financially, but also it's important morally that I look after my staff's the information about my staff or the information about my clients, and I do that well and I do that securely. So you want them to look at it beyond the devil of the detail in some of the bits of the legislation which are trickier. I totally get that. So I would absolutely support a review and improvement in certain areas. And I think subject access is very, very tricky area, because we see it from both sides. You see individuals that come in and the only tool they have, the only power they have in a certain situation is to see what's being said about them, is to see the data that's being processed about them. And shining a light on that can be very impactful for them in exercising other rights as well. So I'd urge caution in reining back too much on that, but equally, we need to get better at supporting organisations to understand that delivering on those rights, such as access rights, is a fundamental part of their business, and to try and avoid it. It's not always easy. There's lots of data. It can be really tricky. But we need to get better at having conversations that are honest with organisations that have to comply with this law as to how we can help them do that more efficiently and more constructively.
So obviously, in the Channel Islands, we've taken a really European approach to the law and to arguably to regulation as well. Does it worry you that most of the regulation seems to come from the EU, and most of the innovations that we're dealing with, social media in particular, AI, seems to come from places like the USA and China? Does that worry you? Does it concern you?
My goodness, you could write a whole thesis on that question. And I know I come at this from a really profoundly public sector perspective, because that's the nature of the posts I've held. But I'm really proud of the values that the European Union has stood for over the years, and where they've come from, the horrors after World War II. And, look what's happening in the world. They are never too far away from us. We should never be complacent about those. The data protection legislation was born from those concerns about how individuals can be exploited and harmed, particularly by the state at that point, but things have moved. So I've always felt very proud to be aligned to those values. I get that when you're translating that into hard law, it can miss a trick sometimes. And I also think we need to be a little bit more honest that not all innovation is good. Data protection certainly isn't anti-innovation, but if you think about aeroplanes, they don't go as fast as they can. They go as fast as we think they're safe to fly. So we haven't had those conversations around data yet. And yes, you've seen innovation in air quotes in China and the US, of course we have. But we're also starting to see, especially around children and young people, some of the devastating harms that they're wreaking on parts, especially most vulnerable of society. And I don't think we've quite got to the place where we're having open conversations about that yet. Now, I do want to make it clear, data protection is not about stopping innovation, but it's about making the plane go at a speed that is safe, that people aren't likely to be harmed or to die. And that I do feel very strongly is the reality, that at the minute we're not quite mature in our conversations around the harms and the vulnerabilities of people in those sorts of spaces.
And how do we start those conversations? Because I advise on data protection, and all I ever hear is that it's boring and complicated, and it's another compliance sort of checkbox problem. Does it have an image problem?
It does. Absolutely, it does. And it's something that in the Guernsey office, we've just been really open about and fronted and said, listen, we know we have an image problem. So we can just sit and wring our hands about that, or we can say, okay, we're going to deal with it. Now, we're not going to appeal to everybody with the comms that we do, but we have tried different and innovative ways to reach our community, to get beyond the legal text, to say this is a profoundly human question. It's as much a way of thinking as it is about a legal text. And if you can move the conversation to help them understand that, to help them see, a bit like my epiphany moment all those years ago, once you've had it, you've got it for life. You suddenly see it for what it is, which is just a fundamental and important protection for us all that feeds into so many other areas of our lives. But we're so very fortunate living in where we do, that we don't really think about those rights and freedoms and protections very often. But when you force somebody in a friendly way to think about them, they suddenly think, okay, actually, no, that does matter. That is important to me, and I do want to keep it.
And what works in terms of those conversations? Have you discovered anything in particular that's effective? What hasn't worked, I suppose, is a...
What hasn't worked? Well, there's lots of things that haven't worked, but what has worked, be more positive about it. Just from a personal perspective, I found that the one-to-one human connection, I call it the taxi driver effect, actually, because whenever I jump into a taxi, you get the first question, which is, what do you do for a living? Love, usually, is what's said to me. And in the past, I have actually lied about what I do to avoid the look of horror or sheer, what on earth is that way to make a living?
So what have you said?
I now actually admit it. Admit it. It's a terrible thing to say. And I've made it my mission then to convert them in the short period of time that I'm in that taxi. And I don't think I've failed yet, because what I try and do is help them understand the whole ethical piece, that move away from GDPR, fines, articles of law, sections of law, to say, do you care what your doctor does with your medical information? Do you care what happens to your child's face image? All of those things, you start exploring the things that matter to them and the people they love and the things that they care about. And without exception, been in a fair few taxis over the years, by the end of it, they say, oh, well, I didn't realise I could do that, or I didn't realise that that's what applied, or I had those rights or those protections. And those moments of just transferring a little bit of that epiphany, and that's again the joy of a small jurisdiction. Is you can use that as a tactic, and we've tried to use that in our comms in the Guernsey office to explore the conversation piece rather than the threat. Now, we have to do enforcement, of course we do. That's a big part of our job, and we do it, and we do it well, I think. But we also take communications very, very seriously. It's not a frivolous exercise in our office, because we want to get that taxi driver effect across the community, where they are proud to have a legal framework that protects them and their children and their loved ones and their colleagues at work. And they're proud of what we've achieved in data protection, and they want more of it, as opposed to thinking this is stopping innovation, it's boring, it's bureaucratic, it's red tape. So, and I think that's, again, we won't convert everybody, but it's in our gift to shift the dial a little bit, I think, in how people see us and view us and how people view the issue. I want people to listen to what we're saying as opposed to listen because we're talking. And that's subtle, but it's an important difference.
Well, I think it comes into management as well, the difference between sort of authoritarian sort of top-down management styles and more collaborative, intuitive styles. Those are always big conversations within organisations that we advise. So that's understandable. In terms of children, I mean, you mentioned the sort of existential crisis of social media and exposure to that. How do we talk to children about privacy and data protection and things like that?
It's so important that we do. That's the first thing to say. I think that there aren't many things at my great age that keep me awake at night, but I worry how history will judge us in the future. We are starting to see now what the addictive, by design, nature of social media, the harms, the Molly Russell tragic case. This is real. And we look away at our peril. And these children, our children, the next generation, are in a world of their own with their devices that we do not see and we do not have access to. And there's no other part of their lives where we tolerate that, where we just let them free. And so I think we are neglecting that now. I feel very strongly about that. In our own jurisdiction in Guernsey, we want to start these conversations early because we want the next generation to be the next ethical data leaders. This is not just, again, about frightening them with online horror stories, but it's about empowering them to say, I want to visualize, if that's a word, a world that's different, a world that is not exploitative, a world that is not harmful. And we can do that, right? The fact that it's not like that at the minute is because we have designed it that way. So by definition, we can design and we can imagine a different world. And I want children from very young to feel a part of the conversation, not spoken at, not just frightened about online. This is their life. They're digital natives.
And does it worry you how normalised we make things like surveillance, so facial recognition, having devices on you all the time in school, in university? Does
It
that
does.
worry you in
It
terms of how?
worries me hugely. And I think that the normalization of anything is where danger lurks, because people stop pushing back. People stop requiring accountability. People stop requiring standards and governance. And those things lead to very, very bad outcomes, in my view. So I think we've got a huge, huge responsibility to our younger generation. And we need to start those conversations early. And I worry a lot that we will look back and say we didn't do enough. So again, as a small jurisdiction, there's a limit to what we can do. But I want to finish my career, and I hope I have finished my career in Guernsey, saying we did everything in our power, the small team, to shift that dial again, especially with children. We've got a great schools outreach program run by an incredibly talented outreach officer that tries to engage children on a positive level as well, to start them and engage them in conversations about how we can build something a little bit better going forward.
And do you think schools need to think more seriously about things like access to devices, about how normalised they're making things like surveillance?
Absolutely, I think across the board. But it's one thing when you're dealing with adults, because there is at least some autonomy there and intellectual engagement with the question. Children look to us, and if we normalise, face scanning as they go in, just to get into their school, it says something about their environment. It says something about a surveillance state that they're living in, and especially in an island like this, where what are there security concerns, or what is the data really needed for? Is it proportionate? Where's the data going? Where's it being stored? Who has access to it? All of those questions need to be answered. But first and foremost, I worry that technology is rolled out in these situations simply because it can be, not because it needs to be. And again, we don't do that in any other area. We ask what technology should do in the name of human beings, not simply what it can do. We seem to allow that to happen in the area of data in a way that we don't any other area, and I worry about that.
Because, of course, where that's going next is AI. Are we ready to deal with AI?
Well, we have to be, because it's here. There was a conversation I had with someone recently saying, when AI arrives, how are we going to regulate it? And I was like, well, that conversation should have been had 10 years ago, right? Maybe more. So we have to be ready. And again, it loops back to the sort of problem of looking to law, because if AI is here and we haven't got an AI specifically piece of legislation, I mean, my view is that data protection laws deal reasonably well with the personal data elements of AI. But we can't be looking to primary law in areas like this. We need to be looking to ourselves. What do we want? What values? What do we stand for in our society, in our community? What protections do we want for the most vulnerable in our society, children included? What do we want for ourselves in this? So that's why, again, escalating these conversations to beyond law is really important, because AI is here. It's everywhere, and it can be phenomenal. It makes our lives so much easier in so many ways, but there is a very, very dark side to it, which is often hidden, because people who are not technologists think, well, I can't be part of that conversation because I'm not a technologist or I'm not a lawyer. And we've got to break those barriers down, making the language more accessible. AI is not a sentient being making decisions and putting us on a trajectory that's not of our choosing. We are absolutely not yet. And whether that ever happens is in our gift. I sort of really resist this notion that it's autonomous and that we're just sort of passengers. Yeah, we're not passengers. We are driving. But if we get out the car and leave it to free wheel, then we've given up our responsibilities, not just to ourselves, but to the next generations. And I feel, again, really strongly that we've got to get back in that seat and take control of the wheel. And it might slow things down. This is, again, the conversation that is uncomfortable around technology and innovation. Lots of areas in our life that we slow down, pharmaceutical development. We don't expect things to be rolled out without safety checks. Why do we do that in the world of data? I mean, it's a really, really interesting question. I don't necessarily have the answer. I have some theories, but I think we need to get better at saying slowing down is not always a bad thing when we're creating something new. We need to understand how it's impacting us, especially how it's impacting some of the most vulnerable. and we need to mitigate those risks and reduce the harms.
Because, of course, one of the big issues, we're absolutely terrible as a species at predicting the future. So famously, John Major's advisors thought that email would be a passing fad, and there was no reason the Prime Minister's offices needed to be connected to the internet. When you're dealing with that kind of view, are we ever going to get the conversations that you're talking about, or is it always going to be a struggle?
I'm not going to predict the future. If we expect a struggle and there's no struggle, then that's great. But I think that we need to elevate discussions to not just whether things are legal, but whether they're ethical, and whether they're moral, whether we want them ourselves as human beings. So I'm naturally an optimist, I think, but technology can't fix the things that society doesn't want fixed. So we need to engage as society with what we want to see, and then ask the technology nicely to deliver that for us.
And how do small jurisdictions, going back to that small jurisdiction thing, how do we get involved in that debate? How do we influence it? Have we got any way in?
Oh, I think we've got a huge way in. Doing this, we're talking about it. The articles that I'm been hugely privileged to be given in the local media, they're not just fun. I love writing. I love reading and I love writing, of course. So it's a deeply lovely thing for me to do. I get that, and I'm very, very fortunate. But there is a serious side to that, which is keeping this conversation going. If people see it constantly referred to in local media, in business articles, we normalize the good stuff, right? You talked about normalizing facial recognition, which I think is bad. But we normalize conversations about empowering people, setting a trajectory based on human values around AI and technology and data. If we normalize that, I think it's self-fulfilling. So there's a hugely serious side to the conversations like this that we have, and the comms piece that we have in the office and have had over the years, to engage people on a slightly, it's not a patronizing level, but you're a lawyer, you know full well the language is different. The conversations feel different in a room full of lawyers. But
They're duller, yeah.
But we need to this affects everybody. So it can't just be people like you and me having the conversations. We may not always succeed, but we need to at least try to broaden the conversation.
And do you think that's the most important role of a regulator when it comes to things like AI, getting that conversation going, or is it?
I think it's one of them, but it's a bit like, if you ask somebody, if you're in charge of regulating the motorway safety, well, you can invest your time and money on just having paramedics when things go wrong. Or you can say, okay, how about we get people to drive safer? How about the roads to be built with materials that are safer? There is a myriad of things that good regulators should be doing, in my view, beyond just sending an ambulance in when things go wrong.
And finally, what's next for you?
Well, there's a lovely saying, and I had to write it down because I can't remember off the top of my head, but there's a lovely saying that I think it's Simon Sinek says, that when we work hard for something we don't believe in, it's called stress. When we work hard for something we care about, it's called passion. I've been so lucky to work in an area that I have been so passionate about and care so much about. So my hope is that I can continue in some way, shape or form to do that going forward.
Well, thank you for coming in to talk to us today.
Thank you.
Hope you enjoyed it. And I think if there's a closing message, it's probably, if you're not in the conversation, then you don't really have a stake in the outcome either. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. It affects us all, so we all have a voice and we all need to be listened to.
Well, if you'd like to talk to Carey Olsen about any of the issues that we've touched on today, whether that's data protection or privacy or AI, please do get in touch. Otherwise, we'll see you in the next episode.